I think the first thing I would like to say, so that I don't we don't miss it, was the very first point you started discussing with the Honorable Minister in terms of security. And all I would add to the points that the Honorable Minister made is that as a people, we need to be really intentional in terms of implementing our laws. Okay? So sometimes you have very, very important, very, very progressive, very, very innovative provisions in the laws, just like what you have in the Nigerian Correctional Service Act of 2019. But implementation, full implementation becomes a challenge. So in terms of dealing with the issue of around issue of security in terms of correctional service, what I will recommend is that we try to have effective implementation of Section 28 of the Nigerian Correctional Service Act 2019, both subsection 1 to 3. And that is very detailed in terms of what needs to happen in relation to the different classification of correctional centers. It's very key, okay? And part of that is also all of the major things that the Honorable Minister mentioned. So I would use that to look into the questions that you asked. And I think that fundamentally, the major problem is that people do not fully understand the persons, the kind of people who are in custody. And I think if we do, our response to how we get people into custody and the duration they stay in custody becomes different. So first is to, and I always try to make sure that I make this point any time I have opportunity to speak, is to understand that there are people who are in custody who are innocent. There are people who are there who are minor offenders. There are people who are there who are serious offenders. The reason is that a lot of the burden that you have within the custodial center also has to do with the population too. So being able to understand that when you are locking persons more than what the designated capacity of that facility is, it becomes challenge. There is a challenge in terms of the infrastructure in those places. There is challenge in terms of the time that you can give due attention to proper treatment and processing of the inmates within those correctional centers. So I will take the issues one by one. You raised the issue of food. We just finished talking about inflation. So if you think about what amount of food and what they call gas, which is basically the wood and gas that they use in cooking, that 1,250 would have purchased, or that 700 and something would have purchased. I need us to also factor into this the fact that there is a business dimension to it, because there are contractors who win the awards. Now, when you now know that there are contractors, you begin to ask yourself, what will be the margin of profit from the contractor? So ab initio, the amount is not sufficient. You know, just take to 1,250 and ask yourself how much of this can feed you for the whole of the day, okay? Now, you now ask yourself, when you put the margin of the contractors. But the major question is also to understand that there need to be checks. What is the process itself? So the whole onboarding of that process becomes challenging. And let me ask you, when you look at food, the basic thing you would need is that if you can produce what you eat, it becomes very helpful. A lot of countries are making sure that they are becoming full substance within the correctional center. And I'll give you two examples. For example, in Zambia, all of the vegetables that are fed, that inmates in Zambia eat, are produced by the inmates in Zambia. Maize meal, which is another staple food, you know, that they use. At the time I had went to assess the correctional centers in that country, I found that at that point, there were already 85% substance on maize meal. In Nigeria, we have farm centers. The question is, how can we radicalize what we have to ensure that we begin to produce what we feed? That's one level. And then also the other issues about oversight, to ensure that the quality, the nutritional value, the quality and the size, the quantity and the quality of food is adequate for the funds that are also being kept there. So you need to completely reform the whole process. So yes, there are inmates that die, and
as a result of malnutrition?
For different reasons. And I give you a very simple example. And this is, I mean, I don't know whether you are aware that Prawa is going to be 30 years this year. And so I'm going to give you some history. So it's to tell you that it didn't just start now. I recall several years back, and this I am talking about more than 15 years, 20 years ago. There was a time that inmates were dying like this, especially in the medium security correctional centers. I became curious. So we did an analysis of all of the deaths. So we found out that the deaths were happening like a lot, 5 days, and then they would drop. It looks like it stabilizes, and it happens again. And when we did analysis, we found out that a lot of the deaths were happening during the rainy season. This was a long time ago. So what happened? We became very worried, and we realized that they felt at that point, because they started realizing that they were not having enough intake of proteins. So the welfare officer, God bless her, so she's dead now, Mrs. Bridget Opia in Medium, began to call religious bodies to begin to bring soya beans. So soya beans were now turned into soya beans drinks. You know, they found out that those who were in the sick bay were being given and they were getting well, but the other ones that were in the cells were now getting sick. So they now made sure that the soya bean drink was being given to every of the inmates. That model was discussed with co-warders who came for a training in the training institution there at that time, later on. And we found out that they started doing this in different parts of the country. One day, one of them saw me in one of the correctional centers in the southeast, and he said to me that he went back after that training and started adding soya beans into the soup that they were eating. And that brought down the death rate. So what we realized that because of the rainy season, because the damp cells became damp, so again, there is a need for checks and balances. You need to also be able to analyze it, like the Honorable Minister said when he was talking. That's also part of the thing that we need to be looked at. But again, you remember that I have said something about population. Correctional center is really there to be able to check everything that you see. Part of what triggers it is from the beginning, from the police, law enforcement, to the judiciary, and down. And that was why I took time to explain to you the 3 categories of persons. So when you see people who have no reason being in custody, what it then means, why are they there? Because of course that population has implication in on the food, but the point is that if an innocent person is kept in custody, 1 hour there can make the person to get more contact with criminal, more criminalized individuals that will actually put the person back into a more dangerous pathway going forward. So you see that connection. Those who are minor offenders, why are they there when you have a whole part 2 of the Nigerian Correctional Act of 2019 talking about non-custodial measures? So we have to be intentional in terms of how we truly ensure that it is only using custodial center as a very last resort. So the judiciary, the law enforcement agencies must do the needful, because what they are doing is actually affecting the security of the country. If the correctional facility is overburdened by, and that's one thing we know, when you talk about population, people need to understand what kind of population. The bulk of the people there, over 70%, are those who have not been convicted. And when an inmate is not convicted, this very tense, he wants to go to court. So there's a lot of transactional things that happen. It's very difficult to actually provide proper regime structure within the custodial center.
Okay.
There are a whole section of Section 10 of the Nigerian Correctional Service Act of 2019 that tells you exactly what needs to be done day to day. Risk assessments of every inmate that comes in. From the day when they come in, you have the needs and risk assessment and plan the regime of that person, including where the person is staying in custody, along the risk that that person portrays.
So why does it seem that this Nigerian Correctional Service Act of 2019, is impossible to implement? Because 2019 is 5 years now.
Yes.
Why is it not implementable?
That is the challenge. And I believe that if we can be intentional on this, it will go a long way. Part of that is also about the will. Look at the non-custodial measures. I think that this is one of the best things the country could do for itself. Because once you strengthen that, and from what I have heard, unless I stand to be corrected, there is no funding that have gone to the implementation of non-custodial measures. But meanwhile, non-custodial measures implementation is something that should make everyone happy, because it will help to save costs. It will help to make the community safer. And you may ask me why and how. Remember that if somebody has been put in custody, and the court says you are leaving in 3 years or whatever, of course, when they calculate the remission, you are going to be left slightly earlier than the three calendar year. Yeah. But the point here is that even if the custodial officer find out that you yourself you have not been reformed, you are going to go back and cause problem, They can't stop you. They will open the date to go for you to go, because that is what the court have decided, that you have finished your term.
So technically, the correction center is not correcting people.
No, but there's a point I'm trying to make here. The point I'm trying to make here is that by looping in the non-custodial officers, it means that in the community, so you play three roles. First, the non-custodial officer can also begin, and that's another issue that can also be discussed, is they also begin to take a role whereby you look at signs that can prevent offending. You don't wait for the offending to come. So you see people who are drop out of school, people who are using drugs or whatever. So you do whatever you need to do, families of people who are in custodial centers, to be able to bring certain certainty to prevent. Secondly, when the person is now in custody, the people in custody will take care, isn't it? When the person comes out, the non-custodial officer follows through. But bearing in mind that if, for example, the person has found to be the kind of person that will benefit from non-custodial application, non-custodial measures, as stated under Section 37 sub 1 of the Nigerian Correctional Service Act, whether it's community service, whether it's probation, whether it's parole, whether it's restorative justice, and all the rest of them, all of those, with the exception of parole, will be supposed to be people who have not entered the custodial center. But what that means is that by effectively in supporting this, when the person has been released, somebody's providing supervision.
Thank you very much, Dr.